Every parent's worst nightmare becomes reality when little Elna's leg is crushed beneath the hooves of careless nobles. Her desperate cries for help echo through the village, but fear keeps every door closed and every head turned away. In Holmvik, servants know their place. The thegn's sons ride wherever they please, and common folk like young Elna are nothing more than obstacles in their path. When her leg is shattered in the market square, everyone watches, but no one moves to help. That is, until Thormund the Quiet steps forward. This giant Viking warrior gave up his sword years ago to live peacefully in the woods. But seeing Elna's pain awakens something in him that has been sleeping too long. He doesn't just comfort the broken girl, he builds her a walking brace with his own hands and teaches her to be strong again. What happens when a forgotten legend decides that one child's suffering matters more than keeping the peace? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the thatched roofs of Holmvik like the breath of sleeping giants, and in the half-light before dawn, the village seemed almost peaceful. Almost. But peace in Holmvik was a fragile thing, built on the understanding that some people mattered and others did not. Thormund the Quiet had learned this truth long ago, which was why he chose to live where the forest met the fields, far enough from the village centre to avoid the daily reminders of how power worked in this corner of the world. His modest dwelling sat beneath ancient oaks that had witnessed generations of Vikings come and go, their branches heavy with the weight of time and memory. Inside his simple home, above the cold hearth, where no fire had burned for 3 days, hung his battle-axe. The weapon that had once split shields and carved legends now gathered dust, its iron head reflecting nothing but shadows. Thormund avoided looking at it most mornings, but today his eyes lingered on the familiar weight of steel and ashwood. The axe had been his companion through 20 winters of raiding and warring, through battles that had made his name whispered with equal parts fear and respect across the northern seas. They had called him the Quiet Storm in those days, not because he was silent, but because his fury, when it came, arrived without warning and left devastation in its wake. But that was before he had grown tired of taking lives, before he had learned that some victories cost more than defeats, before he had discovered that the strongest man in the world could still fail to protect what mattered most. Now, at 52 winters, Thormund's massive frame still carried the scars of countless battles. His hands, large enough to crush a man's skull, had learned gentleness through necessity. His beard, more silver than black now, framed a face that had seen too much, but somehow retained the capacity for kindness. The villagers of Holmvik knew his reputation, spoke of him in hushed tones when they thought he couldn't hear, but they also knew he had changed. The wolf had become a sheepdog, content to watch from the edges. The village below him stirred to life as the sun climbed higher. Smoke began to rise from cooking fires, and the first sounds of daily labor drifted up through the trees. Holmvik was neither large nor prosperous, but it endured. The settlement sprawled along both sides of a shallow stream that provided water and power for the grain mill. Perhaps 100 souls called this place home, bound together by necessity and the shared understanding that survival meant knowing one's place in the order of things. At the top of that order sat thegn Ragnar Iron Fist, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his cunning. His hall dominated the hill on the far side of the village, its high roof and carved pillars a constant reminder of who held power here. Ragnar ruled through fear and the promise of violence, backed by his 3 sons who had inherited their father's appetites, but none of his intelligence. Bjorn, the eldest, was a brute who settled disputes with his fists. Hakon, the middle son, possessed a silver tongue that could turn neighbors against each other with whispered lies. And Eric, the youngest, was perhaps the most dangerous, smart enough to be calculating, cruel enough to enjoy it. The Thegnan's family had ruled Holmvik for 3 generations, each adding to the weight of oppression that pressed down on the common folk. They owned the best land, took the largest share of every harvest, and demanded tribute that left families struggling through harsh winters. But it was not just their greed that made them hated, it was their casual disregard for the lives beneath them. In the lower quarter of the village, where the houses grew smaller and the smoke from cooking fires thinner, lived the servants and labourers who kept Holmvik functioning. They woke before dawn to tend the thegn's animals, worked his fields until their backs ached, and fell into exhausted sleep on beds of straw while their lords feasted on meat and ale. Among these families lived Elna Softvoice, though at 15 winters she was no longer truly a child. Elna worked in the thegn's kitchen, her days spent hauling water, scrubbing pots, and enduring the casual cruelty of those who considered her less than human. Despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them, she had developed a spirit that refused to break. Her mother Astrid had died in childbirth 3 winters past, leaving Elna to care for her younger brother Orm and her father Ketil, a man worn down by grief and labour until he was little more than a ghost of himself. But Elna possessed something rare in Holmvik hope. She believed that kindness mattered, that truth had power, and that even the lowest servant deserved dignity. These beliefs made her dangerous to those who benefited from despair, though she was far too young to understand the threat she posed simply by refusing to accept that suffering was her natural state. The market square sat at the heart of Holmvik, surrounded by the shops of craftsmen and traders who served both the common folk and their lords. It was here that news travelled, deals were made, and the complex web of village life played out each day. The square had been paved with stones generations ago, though many had cracked or shifted with time, creating an uneven surface that could trap an unwary foot or catch a wheel. On this particular morning, the square buzzed with its usual activity. Farmers brought vegetables and grain to trade. The blacksmith's hammer rang against heated iron. Children darted between the adults, playing games that mimicked the serious business around them. It should have been a scene of productive normalcy, but everyone in Holmvik knew that peace was always conditional, dependent on the mood and whims of their betters. Thormund had witnessed this dynamic for the 5 years since he had chosen to settle here. He watched from his forest home as the thegn's sons rode through the village like princes, taking what they wanted and treating the common folk like property. He had seen families broken by their demands, watched good people ground down by cruelty and indifference, and he had done nothing. That inaction weighed on him more than any defeat in battle ever had. Once he would have challenged such injustice without thought for the consequences, but age and experience had taught him that intervention often made things worse. The strong could always find ways to punish the weak, and a single act of defiance might bring retribution down on innocent heads. So Thormund had chosen silence, telling himself that it was wisdom rather than cowardice that kept him in the shadows. He traded his woodcraft and occasional metalwork for what he needed, spoke politely when spoken to, and maintained the careful distance that let him sleep at night without the weight of other people's suffering on his conscience. But conscience was a stubborn thing, and Thormund's had been speaking louder lately. Perhaps it was the approach of winter, which always brought reflection on mortality. Perhaps it was the dreams that had been visiting him, dreams of his son Magnus, who had died far from home with questions in his eyes. Or perhaps it was simply that a man could only ignore suffering for so long before it began to poison his soul. The morning when everything changed began like any other. Thormund rose before dawn, ate a simple breakfast of bread and cheese, and set about his daily tasks. He had wood to split and tools to mend, honest work that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering down dark paths. The routine was comfortable, predictable, safe, but safety was an illusion in Holmvik, as fragile as morning mist and just as likely to vanish when the sun rose too high. As Thormund worked, splitting logs with the steady rhythm that came from decades of practice, the sounds of the waking village drifted up to him. He had learned to read those sounds like an old sailor reads the sea. The normal bustle of daily life had its own music, and when that music changed, it meant trouble was coming. Today, the music was wrong. There was tension in the voices that carried on the wind, an edge to the usual morning conversations. Thormund paused in his work, the heavy axe balanced in his grip as he listened. Something was building down in the village, the way a storm builds on the horizon long before the first drops of rain fall. He had learned to trust these instincts. They had kept him alive through too many battles to ignore now. Whatever was coming, it would arrive soon, and when it did, the careful balance that kept Holmvik functioning would shift. Thormund looked up at his battle-axe, hanging in the doorway of his home, its surface catching the morning light. For 5 years, that weapon had remained untouched, a relic of a man he used to be. But as the wrongness in the village sounds grew stronger, he found himself wondering if some things were worth breaking a hard-won peace. The question would be answered soon enough. In Holmvik, it always was. The wrongness that Thormund had sensed in the morning air crystallized into horror just past midday, when the Thegn's 3 sons decided to race their horses through the market square. Bjorn had been drinking since breakfast, his face flushed red with ale and arrogance as he sat astride his massive warhorse. The beast, bred for battle and trained to trample enemies, snorted and stamped in the narrow confines of the square, its iron-shod hooves striking sparks from the ancient stones. Beside him, Hakon laughed at some crude jest, his own mount dancing nervously as children and merchants scrambled to clear a path that had never been meant for racing horses. Eric, the youngest and cruelest of the brothers, spurred his horse forward without warning. "Last one to the mill buys ale for the hall tonight," he shouted, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. The race began, with the thunder of hooves on stone and the shouts of men who cared nothing for the people in their path. Vendors grabbed their wares and dove aside. Mothers snatched children to safety. The elderly moved as quickly as their aged bodies allowed, pressing themselves against shop walls as 3 horses, and their riders tore through the heart of their community. Elna had been carrying water from the well to the Degnan's kitchen, 2 heavy buckets suspended from a wooden yoke across her shoulders. The work was difficult for someone of her slight build, but she had learned to manage the weight through careful balance and steady steps. She was thinking about her brother Orm, who had been coughing again last night, when the first horse thundered past her, close enough that she felt the wind of its passage. The shock made her stumble, and one of the buckets swung wide, sloshing water across the stones. She tried to compensate, shifting her weight to regain balance, but the yoke was heavy and her footing uncertain on the wet pavement. As she struggled to right herself, Bjorn's massive warhorse bore down on her like an avalanche of muscle and metal. Later, those who witnessed what happened would tell different stories. Some would say Elna slipped on the water she had spilled. Others would insist that Bjorn could have pulled his horse aside, but chose not to. A few would whisper that the young lord had actually spurred his mount forward when he saw the girl in his path. What no one disputed was the sound, the wet crack of bone breaking, followed by a scream that cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. Elna's leg snapped beneath the warhorse's front hoof, the bone splintering with a noise that made grown men wince and turn away. She fell hard onto the stones, her small body twisted at an unnatural angle, the wooden yoke splintered beside her, and water spreading in a dark pool that mixed with the first drops of her blood. The remaining horses thundered past her broken form without slowing, their riders more concerned with winning their race than with the human obstacle they had crushed. The market square fell silent, except for Elna's sobbing roar, agonized sounds that seemed to echo off the stone walls of the surrounding buildings. She tried to crawl toward the well, perhaps thinking to escape further harm, but her shattered leg would not support her weight. Each movement brought fresh waves of pain that left her gasping and pale. For long moments, no one moved to help her. The merchants and farmers who had witnessed the collision stood frozen, their faces showing a mixture of horror and calculation. Everyone knew that helping the girl might bring attention, and attention from the thegner's family was never welcome. Better to stay invisible, to pretend they had seen nothing, to let someone else take the risk of showing compassion. Old Henrik the baker took a half-step forward, then stopped when his wife grabbed his arm. Young Sven, the carpenter's apprentice, started toward Elna, but his master yanked him back with a harsh whisper about minding his own business. Even Father Olaf, the village priest, hesitated at the edge of the square, his weathered face creased with anguish, but his feet rooted in place by fear. Meanwhile, at the far end of the square, the three brothers had reached the mill and were arguing loudly about who had won their race. Their horses stamped and blew, their flanks slick with sweat, while their riders passed around a wineskin and laughed about the sport they had just enjoyed. If they remembered running down a servant girl at all, it was only as a minor obstacle in an entertaining game. Bjorn raised his voice above his brother's laughter. "Did you see that clumsy wench spill her water? Some people have no business walking in the path of their betters." His words carried clearly across the silent square, reaching every ear and driving home the lesson that some lives mattered more than others. It was Hakon who suggested they celebrate their race at the alehouse, and Eric who proposed making the girl's family pay for the inconvenience of having to avoid her broken body. Their casual cruelty was nothing new, but today it felt different, somehow sharper, more obscene in the face of Elna's genuine suffering. From his place at the forest's edge, Thormund heard the scream that announced the breaking of more than just bone. He had been carrying firewood back to his house when the sound reached him, a cry of pain so pure and desperate that it went through him like a spear thrust. He dropped the wood without thinking and began running toward the village, his long legs covering ground with the speed of a man half his age. By the time he reached the market square, the immediate damage was done. The three brothers were riding away toward their celebration, their laughter fading into the distance. The merchants and farmers had begun to disperse, grateful to escape without drawing attention to themselves. And at the center of it all, Elna lay broken on the stones, her tears mixing with the spilled water as she tried desperately to understand why no one would help her. Thormund stopped at the edge of the square, his massive frame motionless as he took in the scene. His eyes found Elna first, cataloguing her injuries with the experienced gaze of a warrior who had seen too much battlefield trauma. The leg was badly broken, compound fracture, probably multiple breaks. She was going into shock, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Without immediate care, infection would set in, and a girl like Elna would never receive the kind of treatment that might save the limb. Then his gaze swept the watching villagers, reading the shame and fear in their faces. These were not evil people, they were frightened people, worn down by years of oppression until they no longer remembered what it felt like to act on their conscience. He had been one of them for 5 years, choosing safety over action, peace over justice. But looking at Elna's twisted form and listening to her quiet sobs, Thormund felt something crack inside his chest, not bone, but something deeper and more fundamental. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of careful restraint snapping under pressure that had been building for too long. He walked across the square with measured steps, ignoring the stares and whispered warnings of the villagers. His boots splashed through the spilled water and came to rest beside Elna's small, broken body. When he knelt down, his shadow fell across her face, and she looked up at him with eyes glazed with pain and confusion. "Why?" she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of injustice. "Why won't anyone help me?" Thormund reached out with one massive hand and gently brushed the tears from her cheek. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but carried clearly across the silent square. "Because they're afraid," he said. He gathered her broken form in his arms with the care of a man lifting something infinitely precious, and as he rose to his full height with Elna cradled against his chest, every person in that square understood that the careful balance of power in Holmvik had just shifted forever. In his other hand, Forgotten in his haste to reach her, Thormund still clutched a piece of firewood. But as he looked down at the small, torn leather shoe that had fallen from Elna's foot, bloodied and broken like its owner, he let the wood fall to the stones. There would be time for building fires later. First, there was a girl to heal and a wrong to set right. Thormund carried Elna to his forest, dwelling with the gentle urgency of a man who understood that time could mean the difference between healing and permanent damage. Her slight weight felt like nothing in his powerful arms, but her labored breathing and the way her head lolled against his shoulder told him that shock was setting in fast. Every step through the woods was measured, careful not to jar the broken leg that hung at an unnatural angle. "Stay with me, little one," he murmured, as he navigated the familiar path between the ancient oaks. "We're almost there." Elna's eyes fluttered open at his voice, unfocused but fighting to remain conscious. "Who are you?" she whispered, her words barely audible over the sound of wind through the leaves. "Someone who should have acted sooner," Thormund replied, the weight of that admission settling heavy in his chest. His home, when they reached it, was sparse but clean, the dwelling of a man who had learned to find peace in simplicity. Thormund laid Elna carefully on his own bed, the rough wool blankets softer than anything she had known in her servants' quarters. As he lit the oil lamp that would give him light to work by, she tried to sit up, panic flickering across her pale features. "I need to get back," she said, struggling against the pain. "If I'm not there when they expect their evening meal." "Let them cook their own food for once," Thormund said firmly, pressing her gently back onto the pillow. "Right now, your leg needs attention, or you'll never walk properly again." The next hours tested skills that Thormund had hoped never to use again. He had learned field medicine during his warband days, when battles left men broken and far from any healer's hall. He knew how to set bones, stitch wounds, and fight the fever that followed serious injury. But those had been hardened warriors, men who expected pain and endured it with grim stoicism. Elna was 15 winters old, small for her age, and had never known anything but gentleness when it came to touch. Working by lamplight, Thormund carefully cut away the torn fabric of her dress to examine the damage. The break was bad, but not as catastrophic as he had initially feared. The bone had snapped cleanly in 2 places, with minimal splintering. If he could set it properly and keep infection at bay, she might heal with only a slight limp. "This is going to hurt," he warned her, his large hands positioned carefully around the break. "But it must be done." Elna nodded, biting down on the leather strap he had given her to muffle her cries. When he pulled the bone fragments into alignment, the sound she made, half scream, half sob, nearly broke his resolve. But he had started this work, and he would finish it, no matter the cost to his own peace of mind. The splinting came next, and here Thormund's woodworking skills served him well. He had pieces of seasoned oak in his workshop, straight-grained and strong, perfect for the framework that would hold Elna's leg immobile while it healed. He worked with the precision of a master craftsman, carving the wood to fit the curve of her limb, padding it with soft wool, and binding everything together with strips of clean linen. But wood and cloth alone would not be enough. As Elna drifted in and out of consciousness, fighting the shock and exhaustion that followed her ordeal, Thormund began work on something that had never existed in Holmvik before, a device that would let a servant girl walk again with dignity. The brace took shape slowly under his patient hands. He started with a framework of flexible willow branches, bent and shaped to support her leg from knee to ankle. The base he reinforced with strips of iron from old weapons, heated and hammered until they curved perfectly to cradle her foot. Leather straps would hold it in place, while wool padding would prevent chafing against her skin. As he worked, memories surfaced, unbidden. Magnus, his son, teaching the boy to carve wood beside this same hearth. Those had been good times, before the world had torn them apart with its demands for violence and glory. Magnus had inherited his father's skill with tools, but had possessed something Thormund had taken too long to develop: a gentle heart that sought to build rather than destroy. "What are you making?" Elna asked during one of her lucid moments, watching him through eyes still glazed with pain and herbs he had given her to ease her suffering. "Something to help you walk again," Thormund replied, not looking up from his careful carving. "A walking brace. I've seen similar things in distant lands, but I'm adapting the design for your specific injury." "I'm just a servant," she said quietly. "Why would you spend so much time on something for someone like me?" The question stopped Thormund's hands in their work. He set down his carving knife and looked at her, really looked at her. Beneath the pain and exhaustion, he saw the spirit that had made her dangerous to those who preferred their servants broken. The same spirit that had made her stumble when the horses came, because she had been thinking of her sick brother instead of watching for danger. "Because someone like you is exactly who deserves this kind of care," he said. "You matter, Elna. Your pain matters, your recovery matters. Anyone who says otherwise is a fool or a liar." Over the following days, as Elna's initial injuries began to stabilize, Thormund found himself drawn into a routine he had not experienced for years. He prepared simple meals that would help her body heal, mixing herbs into broths that would fight infection and build strength. He changed her bandages with the care of a father tending a sick child, monitoring the healing process with eyes that missed nothing. But it was the conversations that surprised him most. Elna, freed from the constant demands of her servitude, revealed herself to be thoughtful and curious in ways that the Degnan's household had never allowed her to express. She asked questions about his past, about the lands he had seen and the battles he had fought. She shared stories of her family, her mother's gentle songs, her father's quiet dignity before grief had hollowed him out, her brother's fierce intelligence that had no outlet in their harsh world. "Orm wants to learn to read," she confided one evening as Thormund adjusted the fit of her brace. "He watches Father Olaf during services and tries to follow along in the prayer book, but servants aren't allowed to learn letters." "Says who?" Thormund asked, testing the flexibility of a joint he had built into the brace's ankle section. "Says everyone. The thegn, the priest, even our own parents. Reading is for nobles and clergy. The rest of us are supposed to work with our hands and trust our betters to think for us." Thormund made a non-committal sound as he continued his work, but inside, anger kindled like fire catching in dry wood. He had seen this same pattern in every settlement he had ever visited, the deliberate crushing of curiosity and ambition in those born to the wrong families. It was a form of violence more subtle than sword strokes, but no less destructive. The brace, when finally completed, was a masterwork of both function and beauty. The wood was smooth as silk under his careful sanding, the metal fittings polished until they gleamed, and the leather straps supple and strong. But more than its craftsmanship, the brace represented something unprecedented in Holmvik, a powerful man using his skills to lift up someone powerless, with no thought of gain for himself. When he helped Elna strap it on for the first time, her gasp was not one of pain but of wonder. "I can stand," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she rose slowly from the bed. "I can actually stand." And in that moment, as Thormund steadied her with one gentle hand and watched her take her first halting steps toward recovery, he understood that he had just committed the most dangerous act of his life. Not because of any physical threat he could handle whatever violence the Thegnan's sons might offer, but because he had given hope to someone who had been taught that hope was not for people like her. In Holmvik, that was a revolutionary act. 3 days after Elna first stood with the aid of Thormund's brace, she took her first real steps. The moment came at dawn, when the morning light filtered through the gaps in the forest canopy and painted everything in shades of gold and green. Thormund had been preparing breakfast when he heard the soft scrape of wood against wood behind him. He turned to find Elna standing by his workbench, no longer leaning against the wall for support. The brace held her injured leg steady, while her good leg bore most of her weight, but she was upright, balanced, and moving under her own power. Her face was pale with concentration and effort, but her eyes blazed with a determination that transformed her features. "Look," she said simply, and took a careful step forward. Then another. The brace creaked slightly with each movement, the carefully crafted joints flexing as designed, but it held firm under her weight. Thormund set down the bread he had been slicing and watched in silence as Elna made her way slowly across the room. 7 steps in total, each one deliberate and hard-won, before she reached the chair he had positioned for her morning meal. When she lowered herself into the seat, her smile was radiant enough to light the dim interior of his modest home. "I never thought I would walk again," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When I felt my leg break, when I saw how everyone looked at me afterward, I thought my life was over. But you've given it back to me." Thormund resumed his work, preparing their meal, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her voice. "I only did what any decent person would do." "No," Elna said firmly, "you did what any decent person should do. There's a difference." Over the following days, as Elna's strength returned and her confidence with the brace grew, their quiet sanctuary in the woods became something neither of them had expected, a place of learning and preparation. Thormund found himself teaching her things that went far beyond simple mobility. He showed her exercises to strengthen the muscles around her injury, movements that would help her maintain balance and prevent further damage. But he also taught her to read the forest around them, how to move quietly through undergrowth, how to recognize the signs of weather changes, how to find food and shelter if she ever needed to survive on her own. "Why are you teaching me these things?" Elna asked one afternoon, as he demonstrated how to identify edible plants from their poisonous cousins. "I'm just a kitchen servant. What use would I have for woodcraft?" Thormund paused in his explanation of which berries were safe to eat and looked at her seriously. "Because knowledge is the one thing no one can take away from you once you possess it. They can steal your belongings, destroy your home, even break your body, but they cannot reach into your mind and remove what you've learned." As her physical recovery progressed, Thormund began crafting a second item that would prove just as important as the brace, a walking stick carved from a single piece of ash wood. The staff was tall enough to provide real support when she needed it, but light enough that it wouldn't tire her arms during long use. At its top, he carved a simple but elegant design, a tree with deep roots and spreading branches. "It represents growth," he explained, as he showed her the finished piece. "No matter how harsh the storms that try to break you, if your roots are strong enough, you will endure and flourish." But their peaceful routine could not last forever. Word of Thormund's involvement with the injured servant girl had begun to spread through the village, carried by those who had witnessed his public defiance in the market square. The telling grew with each repetition, as such stories always did, until some claimed he had lifted Elna with supernatural strength, and others whispered that he had threatened the Degn's sons with ancient curses. The first sign that their isolation was ending came when old Henrik the baker appeared at the edge of Thormund's clearing one morning, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle and looking nervous enough to bolt at the first sudden movement. "I brought bread," Henrik called out from a safe distance. "Fresh baked this morning. My wife thought the girl might need proper food while she heals." Thormund emerged from his house slowly, making no sudden movements that might spook the older man. "That's kind of you both. Elna will appreciate the gesture." Henrik shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly wanting to say more but struggling with the words. Finally he blurted out, "Is it true what they're saying? That you carried her away right in front of everyone?" "I helped an injured child," Thormund replied carefully. "Nothing more complicated than that. But they're saying you challenged the thegn's authority, that you showed disrespect to his sons." Henrik's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're saying there will be consequences." From inside the house came the sound of Elna moving about with her walking stick, the rhythm of her steps growing more confident each day. Thormund listened to that sound for a moment before responding. "Let them say whatever they like. When did it become controversial to show mercy to the suffering? Henrik shook his head sadly. You know it's not about mercy. It's about knowing your place. The girl's injury was unfortunate, but interfering with the Lord's business, even to help someone that's dangerous ground. After Henrik left, Thormund found himself remembering conversations like this from his past, in other villages where power was exercised without conscience. He had always moved on before, telling himself that these problems were not his to solve. But now, watching Elna practice walking with her carved staff, he understood that some responsibilities could not be avoided forever. That evening, as they shared their meal by the light of the oil lamp, Elna brought up the subject that both of them had been avoiding. I heard voices earlier, she said carefully. Someone brought news from the village. Henrik brought bread from his wife. Good people, trying to help in their own way. And warnings? Thormund met her eyes across the small table. Some of those too. Elna was quiet for a long moment, absently running her fingers along the smooth wood of her walking stick. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but thoughtful. They'll come for me eventually, won't they? The Thegn's family. They can't let this stand, a servant being helped so publicly, so openly. It sets a bad example. They might try, Thormund admitted, but they'll have to go through me first. And then what? You fight the Thegn's sons, maybe kill one or all of them, and then what happens to this village? What happens to my father and brother, and to all the other families who had nothing to do with this? The question cut straight to the heart of Thormund's dilemma. Violence would solve nothing, it would only bring retribution down on innocent heads. But allowing injustice to continue unchallenged was its own form of violence, a slow poison that killed hope and dignity by degrees. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know that doing nothing isn't an option anymore. Some lines once crossed cannot be uncrossed. Elna nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a shared burden accepted. Whatever came next, they would face it together, the broken servant girl who refused to stay broken, and the warrior who had remembered why some things were worth fighting for. Outside, the wind stirred the ancient oaks, and somewhere in the village below, plans were already being made to restore the proper order of things. The iron gauntlet arrived on the 7th day, delivered by a boy barely old enough to hold a sword, but already wearing the colours of the Thegn's household. Thormund found it waiting outside his door when he went to collect firewood, the polished metal gleaming like a promise of violence in the morning sun. Inside the gauntlet was a simple message written on parchment in an educated hand. Return what you have taken, or face the consequences of your theft. Elna read the note over his shoulder, her face paling as she understood the implications. They mean me, she said quietly. I'm what they think you've stolen. Thormund crumpled the parchment and tossed it into the fire, where it caught immediately and burned with a brief, bright flame. You're not property to be stolen or returned. You're a person with the right to choose your own path. Tell that to the thegn. I will, if he gives me the chance. The gauntlet itself was a masterwork of the armourer's craft, fitted with articulated joints that would allow full movement while providing complete protection for the hand and forearm. But it was also a symbol understood by every warrior in the northern lands. When a lord sent someone his gauntlet, it meant that diplomacy had ended and combat would soon begin. Word of the challenge spread through Holmvik faster than fire through dry grass. By midday, villagers were gathering in small groups to whisper about what it might mean. Some remembered stories of Thormund's past, tales that had grown in the telling until he seemed more legend than man. Others worried about what would happen to their quiet village if violence erupted between the hermit warrior and their lord's family. The first test came that afternoon, when Bjorn Ironfist himself rode up the forest path with 2 of his father's men-at-arms flanking him. They stopped at the edge of Thormund's clearing, close enough to be seen and heard, but far enough away to retreat quickly if the situation turned dangerous. "Thormund the Quiet," Bjorn called out. his voice carrying the arrogant confidence of a man who had never faced real opposition. "My father wishes to speak with you about the stolen property you're harboring." Thormund emerged from his house slowly, making no sudden movements, but also showing no sign of fear or deference. His massive frame filled the doorway, and even at a distance, his presence was imposing enough to make the horses shift nervously under their riders. "I harbor no stolen property," Thormund replied, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Only an injured girl who needed help." "The servant belongs to my family," Bjorn said. "Her labor, her service, her life, all of it belongs to us by right. You had no authority to take her from her duties." "I had the authority of basic human decency. Perhaps you should try it sometime." The insult hung in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. Bjorn's face flushed red with anger, and his hand dropped instinctively to his sword hilt. The two men-at-arms exchanged nervous glances, clearly uncertain whether they were expected to fight a legend over a servant girl. "Careful." "Old man," Bjorn snarled. "You may have been feared once, but that was long ago. I am not some green boy to be intimidated by stories and reputation." Thormund took 3 steps forward, closing half the distance between them. Even that small movement was enough to demonstrate the controlled power in his frame, the way he moved like a predator, all coiled muscle and deadly intent despite his advanced years. "Then come down from your horse and show me what you've learned," Thormund said, his voice dropping to the low, dangerous tone that had once made hardened warriors step back in fear. "Or ride home to your father and tell him that threats will not solve his problems." For a long moment the standoff held. Bjorn's pride warred with his survival instincts, while his companions clearly hoped their young lord would choose discretion over valor. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring until Elna's voice broke it. "Stop." She emerged from the house, leaning on her walking stick, the wooden brace visible beneath her dress, but her posture straight and dignified. Despite her youth and obvious injury, she carried herself with a quiet authority that commanded attention. "I am not stolen property," she said, addressing Bjorn directly. "I am a person with my own voice, and I choose to stay here while I recover from the injuries your family caused." Bjorn's sneer was ugly to see. "Servants don't get to choose anything, girl. You'll return to your duties immediately, or face punishment for rebellion." "What duties?" Elna asked, raising her walking stick slightly. "Standing all day in a kitchen with a broken leg? Carrying water when I can barely walk? Your family crippled me for sport, and now you demand I pretend it never happened?" The truth of her words struck home visibly. Even the 2 men-at-arms looked uncomfortable, perhaps remembering their own families and daughters. But Bjorn's anger only deepened at being challenged so openly by someone he considered beneath his notice. "You forget your place," he said, spurring his horse a few steps closer. "Perhaps a few days in the stocks will remind you of proper respect for your betters." That was when Thormund moved. Not attacking, but simply placing himself between Bjorn's horse and Elna, his presence radiating the kind of threat that needed no words to communicate. The war horse, trained for battle but not stupid, shied away from the giant warrior, nearly unseating its rider. "The girl is under my protection," Thormund said quietly. "Anyone who wants to harm her will have to deal with me first." "And you think that frightens us?" Bjorn demanded, though his horse continued to dance nervously beneath him. "You think your reputation will protect you from justice?" "I think," Thormund said, "that you should consider very carefully what kind of justice you're really seeking. Is it justice to punish a girl for being injured by your recklessness? Is it justice to demand she work when she can barely stand? Or is this about something else entirely, about maintaining the illusion that power gives you the right to treat people as objects?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and for the first time, Bjorn seemed to realize that this confrontation was about more than just retrieving a runaway servant. This was about the fundamental order of things in Holmvik, about who had the right to decide how power was used. "This isn't over," Bjorn said finally. wheeling his horse around. "My father will hear about your defiance, all of it." As the three riders disappeared back down the forest path, Elna moved to stand beside Thormund, her walking stick planted firmly in the earth. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes," Thormund agreed, "but next time they won't come just to talk." From his house he could see the iron gauntlet still lying where he had left it, catching the afternoon light like a promise of violence to come. Soon he would need to decide whether to pick it up, and with it, accept the challenge that would change everything for both of them. The quiet years were ending, and Thormund found himself strangely relieved. Some burdens could only be lifted through action, no matter how high the cost. The war banner appeared 3 days after Bjorn's visit, hanging from the ancient oak that marked the boundary between Thormund's clearing and the village proper. No one saw who hung it there. It simply materialized with the morning mist, as if the forest itself had remembered what Thormund used to be. The banner was faded with age, but still recognizable to anyone who knew the old stories. Black wool background with a silver storm cloud embroidered in the center, lightning bolts radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. It was the symbol that had struck fear into enemy hearts across the northern seas, the mark of the quiet storm and his legendary warband. Thormund stared at it for a long time that morning, coffee growing cold in his hands as memories washed over him like waves against a rocky shore. He had burned that banner himself 20 years ago, or thought he had. Apparently, someone had saved a piece of his past, keeping it safe against the day it might be needed again. "I didn't know you were famous," Elna said, joining him in the doorway. Her walking had improved dramatically over the past week, and she moved with growing confidence despite the wooden brace that still supported her injured leg. "I was a lot of things I'm not proud of," Thormund replied, not taking his eyes off the banner. "Fame was the least of them. But you fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves?" "Sometimes, when it suited my purposes." He finally looked at her, seeing the curiosity and something else, hope, maybe, or expectation in her young face. "You're thinking that makes me some kind of hero? It doesn't. I fought for gold and glory more often than justice." But Elna shook her head stubbornly. "The stories I've heard don't match what you're telling me. People say you never attacked the innocent, never took more than you needed, never left a fight when someone weaker needed protection. People say a lot of things. Stories grow in the telling. Stories also preserve truth that people are afraid to speak plainly." Before Thormund could respond to that uncomfortable insight, they heard the sound of approaching hooves, not the thunder of warhorse hooves this time, but the gentler clip-clop of a farm horse moving at a steady walk. A moment later, Henrik the baker emerged from the forest path, leading his old mare by her bridle. Behind him walked 2 other villagers, Astrid the weaver and young Sven the carpenter's apprentice. They stopped at the sight of the banner, clearly recognizing its significance, even if they didn't know all the details of its history. Henrik was the first to recover his composure, stepping forward with the careful deference of a man approaching something dangerous but necessary. "Thormund," he said formally, "we've come to ask for your help." "What kind of help?" It was Astrid who answered, her weathered hands twisting nervously at her apron strings. "My grandson was taken yesterday. Eric Iron Fist claimed the boy had stolen apples from the thegn's orchard, though everyone knows young Jorik would never do such a thing. They're saying he'll be flogged publicly unless someone pays a fine we can't afford." Thormund's jaw tightened. "How old is the boy?" 8 winters, Sven said, his young voice tight with anger. "And he was helping me repair the mill wheel when the supposed theft took place. Eric knows this, but he doesn't care. He wants to make an example." The pattern was an old one, familiar to anyone who had lived under the rule of petty tyrants. Create a crime, manufacture evidence, demand payment or punishment. It was a way of keeping the common folk afraid and dependent, constantly reminded of their powerlessness. "There's more," Henrik said reluctantly. "They're saying that anyone who helps the boy or who supports your defiance with the girl will face similar charges. False accusations, impossible fines, public punishment. They're using fear to turn the village against you. Elna moved to Thormund's side, her walking stick planted firmly in the earth. And is it working? The three villagers exchanged uncomfortable glances before Astrid spoke up. Some are afraid, yes, but others remember what it was like before, when we had to watch injustice happen and pretend we didn't see it. Your stand has given them hope that things can be different. Hope is dangerous, Thormund said quietly. So does despair, Elna said firmly. At least hope offers the chance that things might get better. That afternoon brought more visitors, a steady stream of villagers who came to see the legendary banner for themselves and to judge whether the man who had once carried it might still have the will to fight for something beyond his own interests. They came in small groups, careful not to attract too much attention, but their collective presence was impossible to miss. Some came with stories of their own grievances, unfair taxes, arbitrary punishments, family members driven away by the thegn's cruelty. Others brought offers of support, pledging whatever help they could provide if Thormund chose to act. A few came simply to see if the stories were true, if the quiet storm really had returned to challenge the established order. But it was Father Olaf's arrival near sunset that surprised Thormund the most. The old priest came alone, his weathered face grave with the weight of whatever mission had brought him to the forest clearing. "I've come to hear your confession," Father Olaf said without preamble. "If you're planning what I think you're planning, you should make peace with God before you begin." Thormund almost smiled at the priest's directness. "What makes you think I'm planning anything?" "Because I know what that banner means, and I know what kind of man hangs it when he's ready to fight again." Father Olaf's eyes were sharp, despite his advanced years. "The question is whether you're fighting for revenge or justice. The difference matters, both to God and to the people who are looking to you for leadership. I never asked to lead anyone. Leadership isn't about asking. It's about accepting responsibility when circumstances demand it." The priest gestured toward the village below them, where cooking fires were beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. "Those people down there have lived in fear for so long they've forgotten what it feels like to stand up straight. You've reminded them. Just by helping one injured girl, now they're looking to see if you'll help them remember the rest." That evening, after the last visitor had departed and the forest had settled into its nighttime quiet, Thormund sat beside his fire with Elna, both of them staring into the flames as if they might find answers in the dancing light. "They want me to be something I'm not sure I can be anymore," he said finally. "They want a hero from the old stories, someone who can solve all their problems with a sword and righteous fury." "Maybe," Elna said thoughtfully. "Or maybe they just want someone to show them that standing up to bullies is possible. You don't have to be perfect to do that. You just have to be willing to try." Outside, the war banner stirred in the evening breeze, its faded fabric catching the light from their window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of resolve, and new opportunities to either fulfill or disappoint the hopes that had been placed on his shoulders. But tonight, for just a little while longer, Thormund allowed himself to sit in peace with the girl whose courage had awakened his own, and to remember what it felt like to fight for something worth preserving. The letter arrived with the dawn, carried by a raven that perched on Thormund's windowsill and refused to leave until he took the message from its leg. The bird was old, its feathers dulled with age, but its eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. After delivering its burden, the raven fixed Thormund with a stare that felt like judgment before taking wing and disappearing into the morning sky. The parchment was yellowed with age, the wax seal broken long ago, and resealed with newer wax. Thormund recognized the handwriting before he read the first word his own hand from 20 years past, when he had been a different man living a different life. Asterisk, Father, asterisk, asterisk. If you are reading this, then someone has decided the time has come for truth. I pray it finds you well, and I pray you will understand why I wrote these words. Asterisk. Asterisk. By now you have surely heard the stories of what happened at Bjornstead, how I died defending the servant families from Lord Gunnar's men. The official tale speaks of bandits and unfortunate timing, but you deserve to know what really occurred. Asterisk. Asterisk. I was not supposed to be there that day. My patrol route took me along the coast road, miles from the settlement, but young Astrid, the baker's daughter, had sought me out the night before, begging for help. She told me that Lord Gunnar planned to take the harvest tithes early, leaving the families with nothing to survive the winter. When they protested, he threatened to burn their homes and sell their children to slavers. Asterisk. Asterisk. I could have reported this to my superiors and let them handle it through proper channels. That would have been the safe choice, the wise choice. But I remembered the lessons you taught me about protecting the innocent, about standing between the strong and the weak when no one else will. Asterisk. Asterisk. So I went to Bjornstead. Asterisk. Asterisk. I found Lord Gunnar's men already there, taking not just grain, but anything of value they could carry. The families had gathered in the village square, parents clutching their children while soldiers ransacked their homes. When old Henrik tried to protest the theft of his daughter's dowry money, they struck him down and threatened to do worse. Asterisk. Asterisk. That was when I intervened. Asterisk. Asterisk. The fight was brief but brutal. Lord Gunnar had brought 12 men with him, thinking that more than enough to intimidate unarmed farmers. He had not counted on facing someone trained in your methods of combat. I killed 7 before the rest retreated, but not before Gunnar himself put a spear through my side. Asterisk. Asterisk. I lived long enough to see the families safe, to watch them gather their remaining possessions and flee to relatives in distant settlements. Long enough to write this letter and give it to young Astrid, with instructions that it only be delivered if my death was blamed on bandits rather than acknowledged for what it truly was, an act of defiance against injustice. Asterisk. Asterisk. I know you will blame yourself for this. I know you will think you should have been there, should have protected me as you protected so many others. But this was my choice, Father. My first real choice as a man, rather than just your son. I chose to stand for something meaningful, and I do not regret that choice, even knowing the cost. Asterisk. Asterisk. The families I saved will scatter to the winds, and Lord Gunnar will face no consequences for his crimes. But somewhere, children will grow to adulthood because I stood between them and those who would have harmed them. That has to be enough. Asterisk. Asterisk. I hope someday you will find peace with what happened. I hope you will remember that you taught me everything I needed to know about courage, honor, and protecting the innocent. What I did at Bjornstead, I did because I was your son. Asterisk. Asterisk. With love and respect, Magnus Asterisk. Asterisk postscript. I have asked Astrid to include something else with this letter, my shield, the one you gave me when I reached manhood. I hope that when you see it again, you will remember not just how I died, but why I chose to live the way I did. Asterisk. Thormund's hands trembled as he set the letter aside and reached for the bundle that had accompanied it. Inside, the rough cloth wrapping was indeed Magnus's shield, the round wooden disc reinforced with iron bands that he had crafted with his own hands as a gift for his son's 16th birthday. The wood was stained dark in several places, and Thormund realized with a chill that those stains were blood. But it was what he found tucked behind the shield's grip that made his breath catch in his throat, a second piece of parchment. This one bearing a seal he recognized all too well. The mark of thegn Ragnar Iron Fist, pressed into red wax that had somehow remained unbroken despite the passage of years. With growing dread, Thormund broke the seal and read, Thormund the Quiet. Asterisk. You may remember me as Gunnar Iron Fist, though I have claimed new lands and a higher title since our paths last crossed. Yes, it was my men who killed your son at Bjornstead, though the boy fought well before the end. He cost me 7 good warriors and a considerable amount of gold losses that have never been properly compensated. Asterisk. Asterisk. I suspect you have spent the last 20 years believing your son died a hero's death, defending innocent farmers from my righteous taxation. Let me offer you a different perspective on those events. Asterisk. Asterisk. Your boy was there by arrangement. Young Astrid had promised him certain favors in exchange for his protection, favors of the sort that young men find irresistible. He came not as a noble protector, but as a lovesick fool, thinking to impress a pretty girl with displays of martial prowess. Asterisk. Asterisk. The families he saved were indeed thieves and tax evaders, as my records clearly showed. They had been hiding grain and silver for months, depriving me of revenues that were mine by legal right. Your son died protecting criminals, and for that crime he paid the ultimate price. Asterisk. Asterisk. I tell you this now because I want you to understand what you face in challenging my authority over this village. I have ruled here for 20 years, building my power carefully and methodically. I crushed your son when he threatened my interests, just as I will crush you if you continue this foolish defiance over a crippled servant girl. Asterisk. Asterisk. Return to your forest, old man. Tend your fires and live out your remaining years in peace. Force me to act against you, and you will learn that some defeats echo across generations. Asterisk. Asterisk. Ragnar Iron Fist, thegn of Holmvik. Asterisk. Elna found him an hour later, sitting motionless beside the cold ashes of his fire, the letters and shield spread out before him like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture too painful to contemplate. She read both messages in silence, her face growing pale as she understood their implications. "He's lying," she said finally, her voice fierce with certainty. "The thegn is lying about your son." "Is he?" Thormund's voice was hollow, aged beyond his years. "How can I know? Magnus is dead, and the only witnesses are either gone or under Ragnar's control. Maybe my son really was just a foolish boy chasing a girl's skirts. Maybe I've been carrying the grief of a hero when I should have been mourning a fool." "Look at the shield," Elna said, kneeling beside him and lifting the battle-scarred wood. "Look at how it's damaged. These aren't the marks of someone who died easily or without purpose. And look at this." She pointed to scratches carved into the wood near the grip, marks that might have been made with a knife point during quiet moments. "MPI, Magnus Protector Innocentium. He carved it himself, didn't he? Magnus, Protector of the Innocent." Thormund stared at the faded carving, his vision blurring as 20 years of grief and doubt crashed over him like a wave. He always said he wanted a motto, like the great heroes of legend, and he chose that one, not Magnus the Mighty or Magnus the Fearless, but Magnus the Protector of the Innocent. Does that sound like someone who would die for a girl's favors, or someone who would stand up for families being robbed and threatened? The truth hit Thormund like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping. Ragnar's letter wasn't just an attempt to demoralize him, it was a confession. The thegn had as much as admitted that Magnus had died protecting innocent families, exactly as the boy's own letter claimed. The rest was lies designed to poison a father's love for his dead son. But there was more truth hidden in Ragnar's words than the man had probably intended. He had been operating the same scheme for 20 years, false accusations, impossible demands, violence against those who resisted. What had happened to Magnus at Bjornstead was exactly what was happening to families in Holmvik now. "He killed my son for the same reasons he's threatening young Jorik now," Thormund said, his voice growing stronger as understanding crystallized into purpose. "The same reasons he lets his boys trample servant girls in the street. It's not about taxes or authority or maintaining order. It's about power, pure and simple, the power to hurt people and face no consequences. Elna nodded, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. And now you know why you're really here, not just to help me, but to finish what your son started, to stand where he stood and protect the people he died trying to save. Thormund looked at Magnus's shield one more time, then picked it up and slid his arm through the leather straps. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 20 years for this moment. When he stood, the shield seemed to catch the morning light and throw it back like a beacon. Ragnar made one mistake in his letter, Thormund said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had finally found his purpose. He assumed I would be discouraged to learn, my son died protecting people like you. But Magnus was right to make that choice, and I'm going to finish what he started. For the first time in 20 years, Thormund the Quiet felt truly alive. The restoration of Magnus's shield became a ritual that consumed the better part of 3 days. Thormund worked with the focused intensity of a man preparing for his own death, carefully cleaning away 20 years of neglect and battle stains. Each piece of the shield received his complete attention. The iron rim hammered straight again, the leather grip rewrapped with strips cut from his own belt, the wooden face sanded smooth and treated with oil until it gleamed like polished amber. Elna watched him work in respectful silence, understanding instinctively that she was witnessing something sacred. This was more than maintenance of a weapon, it was communion with the dead, preparation for a reckoning that had been delayed for 2 decades. On the second day, Henrik returned with news from the village. Word of Thormund's discovery had somehow leaked, carried by whispers that spread faster than fire through dry grass. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always did, but the core remained constant. The legendary warrior had learned the truth about his son's death, and Ragnar Ironfist would soon answer for his crimes. The people are talking openly now, Henrik reported, his weathered face creased with worry and hope in equal measure. Some are afraid of what's coming, but others— He paused, searching for the right words. Others are saying it's about time someone made the thegn pay for his cruelty. And Ragnar? Thormund asked, not looking up from the shield as he worked oil into a particularly stubborn stain. What is his response to all this talk? He's called for a public assembly 3 days hence. Says he wants to address the rumors and restore order to the village. Henrik's voice dropped to a worried whisper. But word is, he's also sent messengers to his brother's holdings, calling for reinforcements. That night, as Thormund sat by his fire, polishing the final details of the shield's restoration, Elna brought up the subject both of them had been avoiding. I want to stand with you, she said without preamble. When you face him, I want to be there. Absolutely not. Thormund's response was immediate and final. You're barely healed, and this isn't your fight. It is my fight, Elna said firmly, tapping her walking stick against the floor for emphasis. It's been my fight since the moment his sons trampled me in the street. It's the fight of every person in this village who's been told they don't matter, that their pain is acceptable as long as it doesn't inconvenience their betters. Thormund set down his polishing cloth and looked at her seriously. You could die. Do you understand that? This won't be like the stories, where the hero always wins and the innocent are protected. Ragnar has men-at-arms, weapons, training. I'm one aging warrior with a grudge and a shield. You're also the man who saved me when no one else would, the man who taught me that knowledge is the one thing no one can take away. The man who showed me that standing up to bullies is not only possible but necessary. Elna's voice grew stronger with each word. I learned those lessons from watching you. Now let me show you that I learned them well. Before Thormund could argue further, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, multiple people moving through the forest with the careful stealth of those who didn't want to be observed. Thormund reached for his old battle-axe, then hesitated as he recognized one of the voices carrying through the darkness. Father Olaf emerged from the shadows first. followed by a group that made Thormund's breath catch in his throat. Astrid the Weaver was there, carrying what looked like a bolt of fine cloth. Young Sven bore a leather satchel that clinked with the sound of metal tools. Behind them came more villagers, men and women, whose faces showed the weathered determination of people who had finally decided to stop accepting injustice. "We've come to help prepare," Father Olaf said simply. "Each of us has brought what we can offer." Astrid stepped forward and unrolled her cloth, revealing a beautifully woven cloak in deep blue wool, with silver threads worked into intricate patterns around the edges. "I saved this for my daughter's wedding," she said, "but I think Magnus would approve of its use today." Sven opened his satchel and began laying out tools and materials: leather strips for binding armor, steel rings for reinforcing weak points, a small hammer for adjustments. "My master sent these," he said. "He's too afraid to come himself, but he wants you to know that some of us remember what honor means." One by one, the villagers presented their contributions. Food for strength, herbs for healing wounds, small weapons that could be concealed and used if the situation turned desperate. Each gift was modest, the offering of people who had little to spare, but together they represented something profound, a community finally choosing to stand against its oppressors. The most unexpected gift came from Henrik's wife, who had never spoken more than a dozen words to Thormund in all the years he had lived near their village. She pressed a small wooden carving into his hands, a miniature shield with Magnus's initials burned into the surface. "I made this after we heard about your boy," she said quietly. "Seemed wrong that no one should remember what he died for. Thought maybe it would give you strength to know that some of us never forgot." As the evening progressed, the gathering took on the quality of a ritual. Stories were shared not just of recent injustices, but of older grievances that had festered in silence for years. Families destroyed by Ragnar's greed. Young people driven away by his cruelty. Elders who had died in poverty, while the thegn's granaries overflowed with grain taken as taxes. But there were also stories of hope, small acts of kindness that had survived in the shadows of oppression, neighbors helping neighbors despite the risks, children born and raised with love despite the harshness of their world. The thread that connected these tales was simple but powerful, the recognition that life had value beyond what those in power chose to acknowledge. Father Olaf blessed the restored shield as the gathering reached its climax, speaking words over it in the old tongue that invoked protection for those who fought in defense of the innocent. As he traced sacred symbols on the polished wood, the shield seemed to glow in the firelight, as if Magnus's spirit had returned to inhabit the weapon he had carried into his final battle. "This is not about revenge," the priest said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Revenge belongs to God alone. This is about justice, about standing witness to truth, about ensuring that the strong cannot forever prey upon the weak without consequence." When the last villager had departed and silence returned to the forest clearing, Thormund sat with Elna beside the dying fire, the restored shield resting across his knees like a sleeping child. "Are you afraid?" Elna asked quietly. "Terrified," Thormund admitted. "Not of dying. I've been prepared for that for 20 years. I'm afraid of failing, of letting down all those people who believe in something better, of proving that the strong really are destined to rule over the weak." "Then we won't fail," Elna said with the simple certainty of youth. "We can't fail because too many people are counting on us to succeed. Your son understood that when he made his choice at Bjornstead. Now it's our turn to make the same choice." Thormund looked at the shield one more time, running his fingers over the carefully restored surface that bore the scratches Magnus had carved there so long ago. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that had been building for 20 years. Tomorrow would test whether justice was more than just a word used by the powerful to justify their actions. But tonight, surrounded by the gifts and blessings of people who had found the courage to hope again, Thormund allowed himself to believe that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Some stands were worth taking, even if they led to defeat, and sometimes The strongest weapon a person could carry was not made of steel and iron, but of the unshakable conviction that every life mattered, that every injury cried out for healing, and that every act of cruelty demanded an answer. The shield was ready. The man who would carry it was as ready as he could be. Tomorrow Holmvik would learn whether 20 years of delayed justice could finally balance the scales that had been weighted toward cruelty for far too long. The village bell had not rung for a public assembly in 5 years, not since the last time someone had been foolish enough to challenge Ragnar's authority. That man, a grain merchant who had protested excessive taxation, had left Holmvik in the dead of night with a broken arm and a clear understanding of what happened to those who questioned their betters. Now the bell tolled again, its bronze voice carrying across the settlement like a summons to judgment. Every soul in Holmvik knew what the gathering meant, and every soul faced the same terrible choice: attend and risk being seen as choosing sides, or stay away and risk being marked as cowards. Thormund arrived early, walking slowly through the village with Magnus's shield strapped to his left arm and his old battle-axe hanging from his belt. He wore the blue cloak that Astrid had woven, its silver threads catching the morning light like chainmail. Behind him walked Elna, leaning on her carved walking stick, but moving with steady purpose, her chin raised in defiance of anyone who might suggest she had no right to be there. The village square had been prepared like an arena. Ragnar's throne, an ornate chair carved from oak and studded with iron, had been moved from his hall to a platform at the eastern end of the space. His 3 sons stood flanking the throne, while a dozen men-at-arms formed a loose semicircle behind them. Each warrior wore mail and carried sword and shield, a clear display of the force that backed the thegn's authority. But it was the crowd gathering in the square that surprised everyone, including Ragnar himself. Instead of the handful of nervous witnesses that usually attended such events, nearly the entire village had turned out. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with craftsmen. Elders leaned on walking sticks beside young mothers holding babies. Even children had come, wide-eyed and silent, as they sensed the tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. At the center of this gathering, an open space had been left, a circle perhaps 20 paces across, where whatever was to happen would take place. Thormund walked to the edge of this circle and stopped, making no aggressive moves, but also showing no deference to the armed men arrayed against him. Ragnar rose from his throne, resplendent in his finest robes, and wearing a sword that had probably never been drawn in genuine combat. At 60 winters, the thegn had grown soft around the middle, though his eyes remained sharp with the cunning that had kept him in power for 2 decades. "People of Holmvik," Ragnar began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We gather today to address the poison that has been spreading through our community. Lies and rumors that threaten the peace we have worked so hard to maintain." A murmur ran through the crowd, not of agreement, but of tension. These people had lived under Ragnar's version of peace for too long to mistake it for anything resembling justice. "This man," Ragnar continued, pointing at Thormund, "has harbored a runaway servant, defied lawful authority, and spread sedition among you with tales designed to turn you against your rightful lord. He claims to seek justice, but what he truly seeks is chaos, the destruction of the order that protects you all from the anarchy that would follow his rebellion." Thormund stepped forward into the circle, his voice cutting through Ragnar's speech like a blade through silk. "I seek justice for my son Magnus, murdered 20 years ago while protecting innocent families from your theft and cruelty." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Many had heard rumors, but this was the first public acknowledgement of the connection between the legendary warrior and the boy who had died at Bjornstead. Suddenly, the stakes of this confrontation became clear to everyone present. "Your son died a criminal," Ragnar said smoothly, though something flickered in his eyes that might have been worry. "He interfered with lawful taxation and paid the price for his foolishness. If you wish to honor his memory, you would do better to learn from his mistakes than repeat them. Show them the letter," Elna said suddenly, her young voice carrying clearly across the square. "Show them what Ragnar wrote to you in his own hand." For a moment, rage flashed across the thegn's face, naked fury at being challenged so directly by someone he considered beneath notice. But he quickly mastered his expression, turning to address the crowd with practiced calm. "The ravings of a crippled girl hold no weight here," he said dismissively. "She speaks from madness brought on by her injuries, injuries that were the result of her own clumsiness rather than any wrongdoing by my family." That was when Elna did something that no one, not even Thormund, had expected. Moving slowly but deliberately, she reached into her cloak and produced the village bell's rope, which someone had cut from its mounting and given to her in secret. "Then let me ring for witnesses," she said, and before anyone could stop her, she raised the heavy rope above her head and brought it down against the platform with a sound that rang out like thunder. The noise was devastating in the confined space of the square, but its symbolic impact was even greater. In the old traditions, the bell called for justice when authority failed. By striking it herself, Elna had declared that the time for words was ending and the time for truth had begun. "I call upon every person who has suffered under this man's rule to speak," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I call upon every family that has lost loved ones to his cruelty. I call upon every parent who has watched their children go hungry while his granaries overflow with stolen grain. Let the truth be heard before God and man." The silence that followed her challenge stretched taut as a bowstring, pregnant with 20 years of suppressed grievances and accumulated rage. Then, slowly, people began to step forward. The first to step forward was old Henrik, his weathered hands trembling but his voice steady as he spoke. "My grandson Jorik sits in your dungeons on false charges, 8 winters old, and you would have him flogged for crimes he could not have committed." "The boy was caught stealing," Bjorn interjected from beside his father's throne. "Justice demands punishment. Justice demands truth," Henrik shot back, his fear finally overcome by decades of suppressed anger. "And the truth is that Jorik was helping repair the mill wheel when your theft allegedly occurred. Half the village saw him there, covered in mud and working like a man grown." More voices joined Henrik's, a tide of testimony that had been dammed up for 20 years and now flowed freely. Astrid spoke of her daughter, driven from the village after refusing Eric's unwanted advances. Sven told of his father's workshop, burned on a trumped-up charge of tax evasion. One by one, families stepped forward to name their dead, their missing, their broken. Ragnar listened with growing fury, his composure cracking as each new accusation struck home. These were not the carefully contained grievances of individuals afraid to speak alone. This was a community finding its collective voice, and that voice was calling him to account. "Enough!" he roared finally, rising from his throne with his hand on his sword hilt. "You forget yourselves, you forget your place. I am your lord by right of blood and conquest, and I will not be questioned by a rabble of servants and farmers." "You are a tyrant," Thormund said quietly, stepping fully into the circle now. "A thief and a murderer who has hidden behind his title long enough." Ragnar's sword cleared its scabbard with a ring of steel that silenced the crowd. His men at arms tensed, hands moving to their own weapons, but Thormund raised his empty hand in a gesture that somehow commanded more respect than any threat. "Before we spill blood," Thormund said, "let the people see the truth you've tried so hard to hide." He reached into his cloak and withdrew Magnus's letter, holding it high enough for all to see. "Written in my son's own hand, the night before he died, defending innocent families from your theft." And here he produced the second letter, Ragnar's own words, "Written in yours, confessing to his murder and threatening the same fate for anyone who challenges your authority." "Lies!" Ragnar snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. The crowd was pressing closer now, and some of the sharpest eyes among them could make out portions of the documents Thormund held. That was when Elna made her final decisive move. Walking slowly but purposefully across the circle, she approached the group of children who had gathered at the square's edge. From among them, she led forward a small boy with dark hair and frightened eyes, Astrid's grandson Jorik, somehow freed from his captivity. "Tell them," Elna said gently, kneeling beside the boy despite the pain it caused her injured leg. "Tell them what really happened in the dungeon." Jorik's voice was barely a whisper, but in the perfect silence of the square, every word carried clearly. "The Lord's son said I could go free if I would say I saw the big man threatening people. Said he'd give me silver and my family wouldn't be hurt anymore." The admission hit the crowd like a physical blow. Here was proof of what they had long suspected, that Ragnar's justice was a sham, his accusations manufactured, his authority built on lies and intimidation. Eric stepped forward, his face flushed with rage and embarrassment. "The boy lies. He's been coached by these rebels to spread falsehoods." But his protest was drowned out by a new sound, the steady rhythm of Elna's walking stick against the stone pavement as she approached the platform where the thegn's family stood. Despite her youth and obvious injury, she moved with a dignity that commanded attention from everyone present. When she reached the platform's base, she stopped and looked up at Ragnar with eyes that held no fear, only determination. "I have something that belongs to you," she said, reaching into her cloak once more. What she withdrew was a simple pair of leather shoes, new ones, well-made and sturdy, clearly crafted by skilled hands. She set them carefully on the platform's edge where everyone could see them. "These were made for me by the women of this village," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "To replace the ones your sons destroyed when they trampled me in the street. They represent something you can never understand, a community that cares for its own, that lifts up the fallen instead of grinding them beneath their heels." She turned to face the crowd, standing straighter than anyone thought possible for someone with her injuries. "You want to know what victory looks like? It's not about defeating tyrants with swords. It's about refusing to let them break your spirit. It's about standing together when they try to divide you. It's about remembering that every person matters, even those they tell you don't count." The silence that followed was profound, pregnant with the weight of truth finally spoken. And in that silence, something fundamental shifted in the balance of power in Holmvik, not through violence, but through the simple act of one young woman refusing to be anything less than fully human in the face of those who would deny her dignity. The silence that followed Elna's speech stretched until it seemed the whole world had stopped to listen. Then, like ice breaking on a spring river, the tension shattered not into violence, but into something unprecedented in Holmvik's long history. The crowd began to move, not away from the confrontation, but toward it. Men and women who had spent their lives avoiding their lord's attention now stepped forward with quiet determination. They formed a circle around Elna and Thormund, not threatening but clearly protective, their bodies creating a barrier between the girl who had spoken truth and those who might seek to silence her. Ragnar looked around at the faces surrounding him and saw something that made his practiced confidence falter. These were not the cowed subjects he had ruled for 20 years. These were people who had remembered what dignity felt like, and they were not prepared to give it up again. "You think you've won something here?" Ragnar said, his voice carrying less conviction than before. "You think pretty words and sob stories change anything? I still have men. I still have weapons. I still have the king's authority backing my rule." "Do you?" Thormund asked quietly, not moving from his position but somehow seeming to fill more space. "Look around you, Ragnar. Look at your men." The thegn's men-at-arms had indeed begun to shift uncomfortably. These were not foreign mercenaries fighting for gold. These were local men who had families in the crowd, children who might need protection, elderly parents who deserved better than a life of fear. Slowly, one by one, they began to lower their weapons. It was Bjorn who broke first, his fury overcoming what little wisdom he possessed. With a roar of rage, he drew his sword and charged into the circle. aiming for Thormund, but willing to cut down anyone who stood in his way. Thormund moved with the fluid grace of a man half his age, Magnus's shield coming up to catch Bjorn's wild swing, while his own battle-axe swept in a perfect arc. But instead of the killing blow that his training called for, Thormund turned the axe at the last moment, using the flat of the blade to strike Bjorn's temple, with just enough force to send him crashing to the stones, unconscious, but alive. The crowd gasped at the display of restraint. Here was a man who could have killed without effort, who had every justification for taking a life, choosing instead to show mercy to someone who had shown none to others. "Anyone else?" Thormund asked, looking at Hakon and Eric. Both men had their hands on their sword hilts, but neither seemed eager to follow their brother's example. It was Father Olaf who stepped forward then, his aged voice carrying the authority of the church as well as moral conviction. "Perhaps," he said, "it is time to consider what justice truly looks like, not the justice of the sword, but the justice of right action and proper consequence." What followed was not a trial in any legal sense, but something more ancient and more binding, a community judgment that drew on traditions older than any king's law. Testimony was given, evidence was presented, and gradually a picture emerged of 20 years of systematic abuse that had touched every family in the village. Ragnar, faced with the collapse of his power base and the desertion of his own men, tried one last desperate gambit. "You cannot cast out your rightful lord," he protested. "The king will hear of this rebellion and send armies to restore order." "The king," Father Olaf said with gentle finality, "cares little for distant settlements as long as his taxes are paid and no bandits threaten the trade routes. If the people of Holmvik send word that their previous lord died in an unfortunate accident and his replacement seems competent and loyal, I suspect His Majesty will have more pressing concerns than investigating the details." The threat was clear: reform or face the consequences. Ragnar, perhaps recognizing that his options had narrowed to exile or death, chose the former. By sunset, he and his remaining loyal followers had departed Holmvik, never to return. In the weeks that followed, the village began the slow work of healing. New leadership emerged, not through appointment or inheritance, but through the natural process of capable people stepping forward to fill necessary roles. Decisions were made collectively, with voices that had been silent for decades finally heard and respected. Thormund found himself cast in a role he had never sought, not as a lord or ruler, but as protector and counselor. People brought their disputes to him not because he demanded obedience, but because they trusted his judgment and knew he would not favor the strong over the weak. But it was the memory stone that truly marked the transformation of Holmvik. Carved by Thormund and Elna working together, the monument stood in the center of the village square where Ragnar's throne had once been. On its surface were inscribed the names of all who had suffered under the old regime, Magnus among them, but also the countless others whose pain had been ignored for too long. Above the names, carved in letters deep enough to last for generations, was a simple inscription: "Here stands witness to the truth that every life has worth, that every voice deserves to be heard, and that justice delayed is not justice denied, if good people have the courage to act when the time is right." Elna, now walking without assistance though she still carried her carved staff as a reminder of her journey, read those words aloud each morning as the village stirred to life. Her leg had healed as well as Thormund had hoped, with only a slight limp that did nothing to slow her determined stride. On the anniversary of the day she had been trampled in the street, Elna and Thormund stood together beside the memory stone, watching the sun rise over a village transformed. Children played in the square without fear. Adults went about their work with dignity and tact. The elderly received care instead of neglect. Was it worth it? Elna asked, her hand resting on the stone's warm surface. All the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, was the cost worth what we gained? Thormund looked at the scene before them, free people living free lives, protected by justice rather than oppressed by power, and thought of his son, who had paid the ultimate price for the same vision. "Ask me again in 20 years," he said quietly. "When these children have grown up knowing that their voices matter, when they've learned that standing up for what's right is not only possible but necessary, ask me then if the cost was worth paying." But in his heart, Thormund already knew the answer. Some battles were worth fighting not for the victory they brought, but for the future they made possible. Some stands were worth taking not for personal gain, but for the simple principle that every human being deserved to live with dignity. In Holmvik, at least, that principle had finally taken root, and with proper tending, Thormund believed it would grow strong enough to last for generations to come.